Hare Krishna. Today we'll be discussing chapter 3 of Srimad Bhagavad-Gita, text 35 explanation. It is far better to discharge one's prescribed duties, even though they may be faulty, than other duties. Distraction is the course of performing one's own duty is better than engaging in another's duties, for to follow up another's path is dangerous. One should therefore discharge his prescribed duties in full Krishna consciousness rather than those prescribed for others. Prescribed duties complement one's psychological condition under the spell of modes of material nature. Spiritual duties are as ordered by the spiritual master for the transcendental service of Krishna, but both materially or spiritually. One should stick to his prescribed duties even up to death, rather than imitate another's prescribed duties. Duties on the spiritual platform and duties on the material platform may be different, but the principles of following the authorized direction is always good for the performer. When one is under the spell of the modes of material nature, one should follow the prescribed duties rules for a particular situation and should not imitate others. For example, a Brahmana who is the mode of a goodness is non-violent, whereas Kshatriya, who is the mode of passion, is allowed to be violent. As such as Kshatriya it is to be better to be vanquished following the rules of violence than to imitate Brahmana who follows the principles of non-violence. Everyone has to cleanse his heart by gradual process, not abruptly. However, when one transcends the mode of material nature and is fully situated in Krishna consciousness, he can perform anything and everything under the direction of bona fide spiritual master. In that complete stage of Krishna consciousness, the Kshatriya may act as Brahmana or Brahmana may act as Kshatriya. In the transcendental age, the distinction of the material world do not apply. For example, Vishwamitra was originally a Kshatriya, but later on he acted as a Brahmana, whereas Parashurama was a Brahmana, but later on he acted as a Kshatriya. Being transcendentally situated, they could do so, but as long as one is on the material platform, he must perform his duties according to the modes of material nature. At the same time, he must have a full sense of a Krishna consciousness. Arjuna Uvacha, text 36, translation. Arjuna said, O descendant of Vrishni, by what is one impelled to sinful acts, even unwillingly, as if engaged by force? A living entity as a part and parcel of Supreme is originally spiritual, pure and free from all material contamination. Therefore, by nature, he is not subjected to the sins of a material world. But when he is in contact with the material nature, he acts in many sinful ways without hesitation, and sometimes even against his will. As such, Arjuna's question to Krishna is very important as to perverted nature of a living entities. Although the living entity sometimes does not want to act in sin, he is still forced to act. Sinful actions are not, however, impelled by the supersoul within, but are due to another cause, as Lord explains in the next verse. Sri Bhagavan Vacha, text 37, explanation. The blessed Lord said, it is lust only, Arjuna, which is born of a contact with the material modes of passion and later transferred into wrath, and which is the all devouring sinful enemy of the world. When a living entity becomes in contact with the material creation, his eternal love for Krishna is transformed into lust. In association with the mode of passion, or in the words, the sense of love of a good God becomes transformed into lust. As the milk in contact with sour tamarind is transformed into yogurt, then again when a lust is unsatisfied, it turns into wrath. Wrath is transformed into illusion, and illusion continues the material existence. Therefore, lust is the greatest enemy of the living entity, and it is lust only which induces the pure living entity to remain entangled in the material world. Wrath is the manifestation of the mode of ignorance. These modes exhibit themselves as a wrath and other corollaries. If, therefore, the mode of passion, instead of being degraded into the modes of ignorance or elevated to modes of goodness by the prescribed method of living and acting. Then one can be saved from the degradation of earth by the spiritual attachment. The Supreme Personality of Godhead expanded himself into many for his ever-increasing spiritual bliss, and the living entities are part and parcel of the spiritual bliss. They also have a partial independence, but by misuse of their independence, when the service attitude is transformed into the propensity of a sense enjoyment, they come under the sway of lust. This material creation is created by the Lord to give a facility to the conditioned soul to fulfill these lustful propensities, and when they are completely baffled by the prolonged lustful activities, the living entities begin to inquire about their real position. This inquiry is beginning of the Vedanta Sutras, wherein it is said, one should inquire into the Supreme, and the Supreme is defined in Srimad Bhagavatam as the origin of everything in the Supreme Brahman. Therefore, the origin of lust is also the Supreme. If, therefore, lust is transferred into love of a Supreme, of a transformed into Krishna Consciousness, or in other words, desiring everything for Krishna, then both lust and wrath can be spiritualized. Hanuman, the great servitor of Lord Rama, engaged his wrath upon the enemies of the satisfaction of the Lord. Therefore, lust and wrath, when they are employed in Krishna consciousness, became our friends instead of our enemies. Text 38 translation. As a fire is covered by smoke, as a mirror is covered by dust, or as the embryo is covered by the womb, similarly the living entity is covered by the different degrees of this lust. There are 3 degrees of covering of the living entities, by which his pure consciousness is obscured. This covering is but lust under the different manifestations, like smoke in the fire, dust on the mirror, and the womb about the embryo. When lust is compared to the smoke, it is understood that the fire of the living spark can be little perceived. In other words, when the living entity exhibits his Krishna consciousness slightly, he may be likened to the fire covered by smoke. Although fire is necessary where there is smoke, there is no covert manifestation of fire in the early stage. This stage is like the beginning of a Krishna consciousness. The dust on the mirror refers to a cleansing process of a mirror of the mind by so many spiritual methods. The best process is to chant the holy name of the Lord. The embryo covered by the womb is an analogy illustrating the helpless position, for the child in the womb is so helpless that he can't even move. This stage of living condition can be compared to that of the trees. The trees are also living entities, but they have been put in such a condition of life by such a great exhibition of the lust that they are almost void of all consciousness. The cover mirror is compared to the birds and beasts, and the smoke-covered fire is compared to the human being. In the form of a human being, the living entity may be revived into little Krishna consciousness, and if he makes further development, the fire of a spiritual life can be kindled in the human form of life. By careful handling of the smoke in the fire can be made to blaze. Therefore, the human form of life is a chance for the living entity to escape the entanglement of a material existence. In the human form of life, one can conquer the enemy lust by cultivation of a Krishna consciousness under able guidance. Text 39 translation. Thus, a man, pure consciousness, is covered by his eternal enemy in the form of lust, which is never satisfied and which burns like a fire. It is said in Manusmriti, the lust cannot be satisfied by any amount of a sense enjoyment. Just as fire is never extinguished by a constant supply of a fuel, in the material world, the center of all activities is sex, and thus this material world is called Maitunya Agara, or the shackles of a sex life. In the ordinary prison house, criminals are kept within the bar. Similarly, the criminals who are disobedient to the law and order are shackled by the sex life. Advancement of a material civilization on the basis of sense gratification means increasing the duration of a material existing of a living entity. Therefore, this lust is the symbol of ignorance by which the living entity is kept within the material world. While one enjoys the sex gratification, it may be that there is some feeling of happiness, but actually that so-called feeling of happiness is the ultimate enemy of the sense enjoyer. Text 40 translation. The senses, the mind, and the intelligence are the sitting places of this lust, which veils the real knowledge of a living entity and bewilders him. The enemy has captured different strategic positions in the body of the conditioned soul, and therefore Lord Krishna is giving hints of those places so that one who wants to conquer the enemy may know where he can be found. Mind is the center of all activities of the senses, and thus the mind is the reservoir of all ideas of sense gratification, and as a result, the mind and the senses become the repositories of the lust. Next, the intelligent department becomes the capital of such lustful propensities. Intelligent is the immediate next door neighbor of the spirit soul. Lusty intelligence influences the spirit soul to acquire the false ego and identify itself with the matter, and thus with the mind and senses. The spirit soul becomes addicted to the enjoyer, the material senses, and mistakes this as true happiness. This false identification of the spirit soul is very nicely explained in Srimad Bhagavatam. A human being who identifies this body made of three elements with his self, who considers the byproducts of the body to be his kinsmen, who considers the land of the birth as a worshipable, and who goes to the place of pilgrimage simply to take a bath rather than meet men and transcendental knowledge there, is to be considered as an ass or a cow. Text 41 translation. Therefore, O Arjuna, best of the Bharatas, in the very beginning, curb this great symbol of sin, lust, by regulating the senses, and slay this destroyer of knowledge and self-realization. The Lord advised Arjuna to regulate the senses from the very beginning so that he could curb the greatest sinful enemy, lust, which destroys the urge for self-realization, and especially knowledge of the self. Jnanam refers to the knowledge of a self as distinguished from non-self, or in other words, knowledge that the spirit soul is not the body. Vijnanam refers to the special knowledge of the spirit soul and knowledge of one's constitutional position and his relationship to the Supreme Soul. It is explained thus in Srimad Bhagavatam. The knowledge of the self and the Supreme Self is very confidential and mysterious, being veiled by Maya, but such knowledge and specific realization can be understood if it is explained by the Lord Himself in Bhagavad-Gita. Gives us the knowledge, especially knowledge of the self. The living entities are part and parcel of the Lord, and therefore they are simply meant to serve the Lord. This consciousness is called Krishna Consciousness. So from the very beginning of a life, one has to learn this Krishna Consciousness, and thereby one may become fully Krishna Consciousness and act accordingly. Lust is only the perverted reflection of the love of a God, which is natural for every living entity. But if one is educated in Krishna Consciousness from the very beginning, the natural love of a God cannot deteriorate into lust. When love of a God deteriorates into lust, it is very difficult to return to the normal condition. Nonetheless, Krishna Consciousness is so powerful that even a late beginner can become a lover of a God by following the regulative principles of a devotional service. So from any stage of life, or from the time of understanding its urgency, one can begin regulating the senses of Krishna Consciousness devotional service of the Lord and turn the lust into the love of Godhead, the highest perfectional stage of a human life. Text 42 translation. The working senses are superior to dull matter. Mind is higher than the senses. Intelligence is still higher than the mind, and he, the soul, is even higher than the intelligence. The senses are different outlets from the activities of lust. Lust is reserved within the body, but it is went to the senses. Therefore, the sense and the superior to the body as the whole. These outlets are not in use when there is superior consciousness or Krishna Consciousness. In Krishna Consciousness, the soul makes the direct connection with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Therefore, the bodily functions, as described here, ultimately end in the Supreme Soul. Bodily action means the functions of the senses, and stopping the senses means stopping all bodily actions. But since the mind is active, then even though the body may be silent and at the rest, the mind will act as it does during the dreaming. But above the mind, there is the determination of the intelligence. The above the intelligence is the super soul proper. If, therefore, the soul is directly engaged with the Supreme, naturally all other subordinates, namely the intelligent mind and the senses, will be automatically engaged. In Katha Upanishad, there is a passage in which it is said that the object of a sense gratification are superior to the senses, and mind is superior to the sense objects. If therefore the mind is directly engaged in the service of the Lord constantly, then there is no chance of the senses becoming engaged in other ways. This mental attitude has already been explained. If the mind is engaged in the transcendental loving service of Lord, there is no chance of its being engaged in the lower propensities. In the Katha Upanishad, the soul has been described as a Mahan, the great. Therefore, the soul is above all, namely the sense objects, the sense, the mind, and the intelligence. Therefore, directly understanding the constitutional position of the soul is the solution of the whole problem. With intelligence, one has to seek out constitutional position of the soul and then engage the mind always in Krishna consciousness. That solves the whole problem. A neophyte spiritualist is generally advised to keep aloof from the objects of senses. One has to strengthen the mind by use of intelligence. If by intelligence one engages one's mind in Krishna consciousness, by complete surrender into the Supreme Personality of Godhead, then automatically the mind becomes stronger, and even though the senses are very strong, like a serpent's, they will be no more effective than the serpent with the broken fangs. But even though the soul is a master of intelligence and mind, and the senses are also still, unless it is strengthened by association with Krishna and Krishna consciousness, there is very chance of falling down due to the agitated mind. Text 43 Explanation. Thus, knowing oneself to be transcendental to the material senses, mind and intelligence, one should control the lower self by the higher self, and thus by spiritual strength conquer this unstable enemy known as lust. This third chapter of Bhagavad-Gita is conclusively directive to Krishna consciousness by knowing oneself as the eternal servitor of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Without considering impersonal voidness as the ultimate end, in the material existence of life, one is certainly influenced by propensities of lust and desire for dominating the resources of a material nature. Desire for overlording and sense gratification are the greatest enemies of the conditioned soul, but by the strength of Krishna consciousness, one can control the material senses, the mind and the intelligence. One may not give up work and prescribed duties all of a sudden, but by gradually developing Krishna consciousness, one can be situated in the transcendental position without being influenced by the material senses and the mind by steady intelligence directed towards one's pure identity. This is the sum total of this chapter. In the immature stage of a material existence, philosophical speculations and artificial attempts to control the senses by the so-called practice of yogic postures can never help a man towards spiritual life. He must be trained in Krishna consciousness by the higher intelligence. Thus ends the Bhaktivedanta purport of the third chapter of Srimad Bhagavad-Gita in the matter of Karma Yoga, or the discharge of one's prescribed duty in Krishna consciousness. Thank you very much for listening. Hare Krishna. Keep listening for the chapter 4. Thank you very much once again.